I'm Julia George, and on the sofa with me this week are Roger Gough, the Conservative leader of Kent County Council, and Charlotte Cornell. Charlotte is Vice Chair of the Canterbury Constituency Labour Party. Thanks so much for joining us both this week. Let's start with the crisis in our hospitals, and let's go straight to Professor Rob Galloway. Rob is a medical advisor to the NHS Support Federation campaign group, and himself he's an A&E consultant right here in the South East. Rob, I've just got in front of me now, released only on Thursday this week, new data on waiting times in A&E across Kent, Sussex and Surrey. This is for the month of December. We've got nearly 4,200 patients who waited more than 12 hours, and this is from the decision to admit. What does that mean?
So I've worked in A&E for 22 years now, and I've never seen anything like this. This isn't just a bit busy. This isn't under pressure. This is a crisis of unscheduled care. And what this means ultimately is patients who are dying because of what's happening. And the Royal College of Emergency Medicine did a paper last year in the Emergency Medicine Journal, where they looked at the data of those who waited more than 6 to 8 hours, what happened to their mortality and chance of death within 30 days. And for every 82 patients who wait more than 6 to 8 hours for a hospital bed, an extra one patient dies. And so that's how the Royal College of Emergency Medicine have extrapolated that 500 people are dying a week. And that's just not what I'm saying. That's what the scientists and the epidemiologists are saying. So this is a crisis. And if we had, for example, 2 plane loads of people crashing every single week, there'd be COBRA meetings, everyone would think it's a crisis. But because it's happening in the NHS, to the most vulnerable in society, people are just saying it's a bit busy, and it's not. There's
12 hours from DTA, from decision to admit. Does that mask even longer waits than 12 hours?
Yes. So the 12-hour decision to admit time is not 12 hours in the department, so it's an underestimation of the number of patients who've waited for 12 hours. And it would be much easier if they just released the data on those who wait more than 12 hours in the department. So 12 hours for a decision to admit can actually be variable depending on the ways the hospital measure it. It could be from the moment that an A&E doctor has referred to a specialist, so you could wait a couple of hours to see an A&E doctor and then they refer, so it could be 14 hours, or it could be from when an A&E doctor has referred to a specialist and they see a senior from the specialty team. So that could be up to 8 hours, for example. They've seen an A&E doctor, then they've seen a junior medical doctor, and then the medical registrar, for example, comes and reviews them. So a 12-hour DTA, you may have someone in the department for 10 hours and the clock hasn't even started. So you could have people in the department for, say, 20 hours and it doesn't count as a 12-hour DTA. And so the 12-hour DTA times are an underestimation of what is happening in emergency care at the moment.
I really appreciate you explaining that. Thank you. Give us a sense of what it looks like in a typical day in A&E right now.
So this isn't about my hospital. This is about hospitals up and down the country from speaking to everybody. It's really demoralising and heartbreaking for us as staff, but really more importantly for the patients, because there are often 20, 30 in a corridor, and these are patients who can wait in a corridor for up to a day. And when you're being cared for in a corridor, subtle signs of deterioration are missed, and that's why people have increased mortality. Then they may go from a corridor space into a cubicle, and they could wait for 2 to 3 days for a hospital bed from a cubicle. And this is not a way to run emergency medicine departments. It means that our emergency medicine departments are full of patients who should be on the wards. So this is in many ways not a crisis of emergency medicine. This is a crisis being played out in emergency medicine departments, and because we cannot get our patients onto the wards. And the patients on the wards cannot get out of hospital because there's so many medically fit for discharge patients, and that's because there's not the social care available, people like home care helpers, and that is the fundamental problem. This is a problem really of social care, but showing up in emergency medicine departments.
What exactly are the causes of the crisis? Is it simply down to COVID and flu?
No, this has been a ticking time bomb for the last 12 years, and it is fundamentally because the way we've been running our NHS. And COVID and flu have been the straw, but the NHS's back has been broken in the last 10, 12 years, and that's because of a lack of funds and a lack of beds and a lack of staff. And if you look at our staffing numbers, they are woeful compared to Europe. If you look at our number of beds per 1,000 people, we've got half the number of beds, say, that Germany have. And so we just cannot cope with any surges. And this is what's causing the crisis, and this is why we've got such problems, and our patients are really being affected now. And so it's not just A&E times, because ambulances cannot offload their patients because there's so many patients in A&E corridors. The waits for ambulances are getting ridiculous. It's longer than 90 minutes on average nationwide to get an ambulance for chest pain. So these are patients, for example, who may be having a heart attack that we're not getting to them in time. This is why this is a crisis of care in unscheduled care at the moment.
How does it feel as an emergency doctor to know that there are people's lives you could have saved?
So it's hard to tell on an individual basis at all. It's all about small factors in terms of you cannot tell if someone's deteriorating as quickly, for example, so there's subtle signs you miss. I know as an emergency medicine consultant and all the colleagues I work with, the nurses, the physios, the radiographers, the pharmacists and the nurses and junior doctors, we are working and doing absolutely everything we can. Despite how difficult it is, I'm incredibly proud of what my team and what I do and what my colleagues do, because we are working incredibly well in incredibly difficult situations.
And please,
and
I just want to say, I do want to say, Rob, that there was no implicit criticism of you. What I really meant there was, how does it feel to know somebody died at home before they even got to you?
It's, you know, it's awful, but we're doing what we can in a really difficult situation, and the question really shouldn't be put to NHS workers. It should be given to the people who are managing the NHS, which is our politicians. You know, the principles of the NHS are really good. The principles of providing care, not based on profit, but based on what's right for patients, is the right thing. And if you had a really good car but was being driven by a reckless driver, you would criticise the driver and not the car. And that's where the focus has to go to our politicians, because this isn't about individual hospitals or NHS managers or anything like that. This is a political issue which must be tackled at a national level now.
I feel strongly that you're nudging me to bring the politicians in, so let's do that. But stay there with us, Rob, if you would. Rob said this is actually a crisis of social care, didn't he? Roger, let's talk about this £200 million that Rishi Sunak says is going to be spent on care home beds to help move people out of hospitals who don't need an acute bed any longer. How does that work, and is it the solution?
Well, anything that brings extra resource in and helps get people out of the sort of situations which Rob's been describing is clearly welcome. Now, I think what we are seeking to do is that much of our focus is on actually where you can get people out of hospital, or indeed, ideally, if you do the work properly, prevent them getting there, through care and support in their homes. Obviously, it depends on their conditions, but care and support in their homes. So I think there are two potential concerns about what may come out of this, though, as I say, it is in itself welcome. One is that you can have a situation where people stay in those homes for longer, and they become more dependent, and that's actually bad in terms of the outcomes for them. There is also a question mark as to what that means from the point of view of local authority social care, because at some point the cost of that could end up with the local authority, and we know what the pressures within social care are. So what was positive was that also in the autumn statement there was a relatively large amount of money that went towards social care. Clearly, you know, in the context.
But some of it hasn't arrived yet, has it?
For us, I mean, we are seeing it arriving, and we are, in fact, that's underlying a lot of the work we're doing with our colleagues in the NHS here in Kent. And I think one of the more positive features was that the relative importance given to social care was much higher than it's been in previous years. But the undoubted pressures are very, very significant.
But nationally, Roger, this funding was originally announced in September. The first tranche is just reaching local authorities now to buy those care beds. And of course, you can't, if you release the funding at the peak of the crisis, you can't prepare for the crisis. So again, this is mismanagement at a national level.
Yes, but I mean, actually, the bulk of the funding I'm talking about was actually announced in October. Was it October, November? The autumn statements. That was the funding that I'm speaking about, and clearly we now see also this additional announcement in relation to care homes.
Let me get back to Rob for a second. Is this money to help people move out of acute beds in hospitals and into any spare capacity in our care homes in Kent, Sussex and Surrey? Is this going to start making a difference quickly enough for you and your teams in A&E departments?
So any additional support to either help discharge medically fit for discharged patients or to prevent patients coming to hospital has got to be welcome. The key investment really needs to be in the community. I know I'm an emergency medicine consultant, but actually what we need to do is invest in things like district nursing, social care, community palliative care and that type of thing to really stop patients coming in who don't need to be coming in and give alternative ways of supporting them and also allow that discharge once they're medically fit for discharge. Because although, you know, hospitals are great if you need them. If you do not need to be in hospital, coming to hospital is not the right place for you because of the risks of infection. And so, yes, any investment is welcome, but the question is, this was totally predictable. The investment has been needed to be as early in this to try and help these problems.
I rather suspect, Roger, that you feel the same way as the leader of a top-tier authority who's got to deliver social care.
Well, clearly, we wish to see resource coming into social care because it's not the only element of this. There is a big element of NHS community medicine as well. But social care is an important dimension to this, and that is everything from preventing people coming into hospital through to ensuring that there is effective discharge and those services which enable reablement and recovery.
Yeah, OK. Quick thought about whether there is enough. I mean, if we want people to go home, and Rob alluded to that as well as care homes, looking after people in their own homes, are there even enough carers? Are we paying them enough? Is it professionalised workforce enough to actually be the point of solving these problems?
There are undoubtedly huge pressures within the social care workforce, and that has been, again, the case for some time. What we are seeing is, and in fact, one of the things that we're using, the funding that came through from the autumn statement for, is actually workforce development, because that, again, is a vital element of this.
Charlotte, let's talk about spending, because when Labour talks about solutions, there's always a cost attached to it. Health spending has risen in real terms in all but 1 year since the Conservatives got into government, these years that Rob was alluding to. It's not enough, perhaps, to meet the demands of our ageing population. Labour wants to invest even more. Where does the money come from?
I'm sure we have an ageing population, a vastly changing demographic, especially down here in this region. I mean, the money comes from restructure and skills and retraining in new buildings and investment in staff. And we've had 13 years of chronic mismanagement, not just of critical care, but it's of social care, it's of the buildings. We were promised hospitals,
but that's
not new
more
hospitals.
Money, isn't it? If you want to have new buildings, that's throwing more. That's not going to...
You can't make things more efficient when you have a creaking service that's falling down both literally and figuratively. So you do have to invest to save in the long run, both in people and in buildings and in structures. There has to be investment.
I don't feel that answers where the money comes from in the first place, though, to solve the problems we're talking about today.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The governments have struggled with this for years. We've had promises of reform from both of social care from both Labour and Conservative governments that haven't delivered for 20, 30 years. It is absolutely chronic.
Do we need to pay more tax for the NHS?
Yes.
Do we need to pay more tax for the NHS, Roger?
No, and I think we need to ensure that there's adequate funding. I'm not sure that we... and it's interesting to note, actually, that whatever Charlotte's answer, the Shadow Chancellor has been saying very much the spending chequebook is not open. OK,
Rob, same question to you. Would all of us who do pay taxes, would more taxes be the answer? Does that solve the problems that you're seeing and your teams are seeing across the South East?
I think when you talk about tax, we've got to talk about fair taxation and taxation of the right people, because people like nurses, teachers, that type of wage really can't afford more taxation. But there are the higher rate people or the people with a lot of wealth. So you could look at a wealth tax rather than an income tax increase, because the NHS does need investment. We've got to be honest. The average investment under the Labour years was a 6% increase in real terms. The last 12 years, it's only been 2%, and that hasn't kept up to the increase in ageing and numbers of patients we are looking after. And so that's why we're seeing the problems. But the other thing we've got to look at is also, I know we've said for some time we've struggled to recruit carers. Let's be honest, since Brexit we've struggled to recruit carers because we've lost so many Spanish and Portuguese and Italian nurses and healthcare associates and that type of thing, that we need to look at our immigration policies. But there's just one thing I just want to say before I finish, is I know we're talking about the problems in emergency medicine, but I just want to reassure people that if you are acutely unwell with an injury or an illness, A&E is the safest place. Most A&Es are still seeing patients quite quickly. It's just the problems about moving on to a ward. So you're getting the treatment. So please don't, if you're unwell or an acute injury, please do not come to A&E, because we are there for people who need it.
Rob,
and that's really important to emphasise at the moment.
thank you for that message, and thank you for everything you and your teams in our A&E departments are doing across the South East right now and every day. Great to talk to you.
Thank you.
Now, could changes to the law coming later this year put wildlife in the South East at risk? The government says it's not going to go back on its commitment to the environment, but Kent and Sussex Wildlife Trusts claim a rush to scrap or amend rules that were originally set by the EU could leave nature in danger. Here's Marcella Whittingdale.
That's the harrier, and then down to the right you've got those teal and...
The Ore Marshes in Faversham, home to turtle doves, curlew sandpipers and spotted redshanks. Campaigners say it's one of many sites across the South East under threat from a change to current legislation.
The risk to the habitat itself in terms of the sort of development. There's a risk to species which are particularly protected under EU law, like bats and dormice and things like that, so particularly rare things. And then there's also sort of really pervasive risks around pollution and chemicals. It's a whole ecosystem which, you know, for the South East is quite an unusual one. And we're very privileged actually that there's quite a few of these sites scattered around this coast, and they all have this EU designation upon them. And that's really what has provided them with the protection that they enjoy.
After Brexit, we kept a number of EU laws to help smooth the transition of our leaving, and many are still in force. Sites like the Ore Marshes here in Kent are currently protected by a range of EU laws. The retained EU law bill means the government would have the power to revoke thousands of laws with their origins in EU policy or replace them with new homegrown legislation. And more than 500 of those original EU laws relate to the environment. The bill sets out how this legal overhaul needs to be completed by the 31st of December this year, and any EU law that hasn't been specifically kept or replaced will automatically expire on that same date.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm looking forward to the Honourable Lady supporting the retained EU law bill.
The government say they're committed to maintaining standards in environmental protection. But experts warn the short time frame could mean a rushed approach that puts the protection and improvement of the environment at risk.
We're getting rid of a huge amount of EU law almost overnight. We're not sure if we know all of the law. We could find out later that law has disappeared without us knowing about it. A lot of law builds on EU law, but if it simply disappears, then that structure could, well, collapse too.
But wildlife trusts across the South East say deregulation on this scale and at this speed will spell disaster for nature, climate change and the health of future generations.
Marcella with our report there. This question to both of you, but let's go to Charlotte first. The government says it is going to maintain all environmental protections that are needed. Do you trust them to deliver that?
Absolutely not. I mean, I don't trust them to deliver anything they promised, that, as we just discussed with the hospitals and social care funding. But this, no. I mean, at the moment, not even the government or the civil service seem to know exactly which laws are being scrapped. There's definitely a race, this is a sort of bonfire of the Brexit vanities, to get Brexit done. And in that race, some key protections for wildlife and sites are being scrapped.
Roger, same question to you. Do you think the government can, with this sunset clause at the end of the year, to either amend or ditch all of these EU rules, or the rules that originate there, can they still protect the environment?
Yes, I believe they can, and in one sense the government needs to. It's committed in a whole number of areas. If you look at the Environment Act with biodiversity net gain, if you look at what's called the 30 by 30, so 30% of area protected by 2030, which is something that then fed through actually into the Montreal Agreement on globally on biodiversity. These are things that can only be delivered if actually we maintain these areas.
Yeah,
there is the sunset clause at the end of the year. There is a sunset clause for 2026 as well, which I believe DEFRA may be quite likely to make use of. So I think we still have some ways to go in seeing how this plays out.
But there are real concerns here. I mean, the Office for Environmental Protection, the watchdog which was set up by the Conservatives last year, they say there is a risk that rushing through these laws could risk the protection and indeed the improvement of the environment.
Yes, and I think the very fact that we set up that office, and indeed we've equally set a whole series of very transparent targets under the Environment Act, should give assurance that this is something taken very, very seriously.
Commitments aren't law, though, Roger. We can't take assurance that the environment will be protected without the laws that protect them. And for places like Sandwich Bay and the Thanet Coast and the ore marshes that we see there, it is the wildlife, but it's not just wildlife, it's also around sewage. And you know, that's such a huge issue in our part of the world. You know, we're scrapping those laws that have stopped some of the worst pollution in our seas, and they're not going to be replaced in time.
Well,
for the
we're
sunset
not
clause.
necessarily scrapping them at all.
No.
I mean, they may well be just moved wholesale into British law, mightn't they?
Exactly. There is the option to do that, and as I say,
Or
there is
improve
also
them.
and the sunset clause in terms of 2026. So,
but at the moment, the government don't know which laws are being scrapped. They promise us that some will be retained, but yet only last week and the week before we have news saying that, oh, we've actually discovered some of these new laws that we didn't know were there. Like they were hidden behind a cupboard, Roger.
One of the main reasons this is happening is that when people voted leave, and the majority voted leave in this country, they wanted the UK to make its own laws. And if you go back to the polling at the time, it says this, YouGov 2016, biggest reason for voting leave to strike a better balance between Britain's right to act independently and the appropriate level of cooperation. They wanted us to take control of our own laws. That's what the polling tells us. Surely, Charlotte, that means the government is right to try and deliver on this. It's what the British people wanted.
I don't think people want the government to rush into a farce, though. There is a difference between delivering and delivering badly. And at the moment, the biggest benefit of Brexit seems to be a blue passport. So I can see why taking control of your laws is something people are very keen to get done. But that rush doesn't need to be at the expense of quality and diligent lawmaking.
I'm reading from both of you, you care about the environment, you want to see it protected. The government says it's an opportunity now to do things differently or possibly even improve things. What would you like the government to do differently on the environment? Charlotte, first?
Well, first of all, I think that they should pause the retained EU law bill. I don't think it's in a state to take to the Lords. I don't think it's in a state to push. They need to think much more diligently and carefully about the laws they do want to retain and put bills in front of the House to retain those laws. OK,
Roger, is there anything in addition that you would like to see done to protect our fabulous environment here in the South East?
Well, I think we do need to ensure that those designations are maintained. More generally, I think what government should be doing is that we have a whole series of independent organisations. So we have, for instance, the Committee on Climate Change. We've actually had within the Conservative Party Chris Skidmore's own committee looking at our environmental situation, particularly in terms of the net zero transition. And I think it's on government to respond to those in a very transparent way so that we see we really are delivering in terms of three key areas. One is net zero. The second is adaptation, because we all know that pressures and problems are coming. And the third is biodiversity, which is exactly what we're talking about here.
I will add that this is the perfect storm. Kent is earmarked as a possible investment zone by the government. If some of the protections for SSIs are scrapped or are not retained, well, you can't guarantee that. No, I mean, the Conservatives are not doing well on fulfilling their promises at the moment. You can't say they won't be. Promises are not law, Roger. But if the investment zones clash with removals of protections on SSI, development could be horrendous.
Thank you both on that very much. Now, what are you supposed to do when the bus service to your village disappears? That's the question being faced by people like Richard Shannon from Conyers in East Kent. He relies on the number 8 bus that's about to be axed. It's one of 56 bus routes in Kent, facing cuts that save Kent County Council £2.2 million in subsidies. Now, here's what Richard has told us previously.
It's just going to be a major impact on our lives. There's a lot of people here that have got cars, but there's a lot of us that haven't. And it's us that haven't, it's going to affect the most. We can't afford taxis. 15, 20 quid each way. Impossible. I can't walk 3 miles to catch a bus, and neither could my wife or my disabled neighbours. We'll be stuck in the 4 walls. That's no life for anybody.
Roger, I want to put Richard's situation directly to you. He says he's going to be left isolated by these cuts. Should he just leave Conyers and move somewhere else?
Well, I think it's for Richard to decide what is there, and I do feel for his situation. What I would say is that in making these reductions, firstly, we are still maintaining actually significant levels of bus subsidy, higher than most other authorities. We did choose, we operate on some very clear criteria as to what were relatively underused services, which were high cost to maintain. And we are at the same time seeking to keep services like the Kent Carrier. We're putting more money into community transport initiatives to try to find ways in which we can, in other ways, more effectively tackle isolation. We are still very committed to bus services. As I say, we still will be putting over £4 million in terms of continuing subsidy. We also have, still sitting with government, our application under the bus service improvement
But
plan.
if you're Richard sitting at home watching this on a Sunday morning, you'll be shouting at the telly, that's not going to help me, any of that.
No, well, I think the fact that we sustained the Kent Carrier may well be.
This is the dial when you can call a bus.
Yes, exactly, absolutely. And I think there are...
On certain days of the week?
Yes, it is a reduction. We won't pretend otherwise.
Okay.
But we did maintain that.
Charlotte, some of these bus routes, Roger was just talking about the hard decisions they've had to make. Some of these bus routes were costing the taxpayer more than £20 per passenger per journey. There's got to be a line drawn somewhere, hasn't there, when they're trying to find £40 million of cuts to their budget this year?
No, I appreciate that local authorities have had their budgets absolutely squeezed by central government. I do know the decisions have been hard and horrible to make. I appreciate that. But for those people in those communities, you're right, the bus is a lifeline. And it keeps people active. Using the bus and connecting with services, in the end, saves health and social care money. The 37, for example, I think was restored, wasn't it, after a brief pause over in Broadstairs. But the 3 months that it didn't exist, people were saying it was like lockdown again. You know, they had to stay at home. There was no choice. And I know some campaigners from all political parties restored that route. It is possible if communities make a noise, hopefully, to bend the ear of our local politicians.
Sometimes, though, it's not the local politicians, is it?
No.
Because all of this comes on top of these taxpayer-supported bus services, on top of Kent saw, I think, cuts to more than 100 commercially operated routes last year as well.
Yes.
Is there anything you can do about that?
Well, we did do quite a lot in many of those cases, which is that we work very, very closely with the operators to try and find ways through, and in many cases we did, particularly, it must be said, in those that affected school journeys, and that was a major effort that we put in over the summer. But it is undoubtedly the case. The bus industry is still under significant pressure.
Really short answer from both of you, so we're nearly at the end of the programme, but I know Labour's idea on Kent County Council is to set up Transport for Kent, a sort of local version of Transport for London. Roger, are there any merits in that Labour idea?
Well, if you get devolution, there are options around bus franchising. That is something which certainly can be considered.
Do you want more devolution in Kent?
We certainly do.
OK, Charlotte, to you on Transport for Kent.
Fixed price journeys, local authority owned, taxpayer funded. It's the dream. You know, that's where Labour would go. The Labour group on Kent County Council, those fixed price journeys, rather than paying £6.20, everyone knows it's £2, either which way. But in the end, local authority owned by the taxpayer for the taxpayer.
And that is your vision for Kent and for buses in Kent?
In the long term, that's what it's got to be.
Thank you both very much indeed. Good to see you both. That is all we've got time for this week from the South East. My thanks to all of today's guests. We saw Rob Galloway earlier on. We'll be back next Sunday. Enjoy what's left of your weekend. Bye for now.